The new VP looked at my 25-year career and called it a mausoleum that needed to be smashed. He sat across the glass table, tapping his stylus, and told me he was going to drill skylights into a climate-controlled art vault holding $60 million in Renaissance oil paintings just to get some natural light. I didn't scream. I didn't beg for my pension. I simply checked the humidity sensor on the wall and smiled. He thought he was firing a fossil. He didn't realize he was actually declaring war on the building's secret owner. Before I explain how a single drill bit cost this man his entire career, let me know in the comments. What's the most ridiculous change a new boss ever tried to make at your job? And if you love seeing arrogance get crushed by competence, hit that subscribe button. You're going to enjoy this eviction. I am Meredith, the Chief Operating Officer who has spent 25 years serving as the cold, uncompromising logic behind the vault, ensuring $600 million in art remains safe through absolute discipline and control. I do not panic. I do not beg. I am a human hygrometer calibrated to detect the slightest shift in atmosphere, a living sensor attuned to the hum of HVAC compressors and the subtle groan of settling concrete. But right now, as I sat in the glass-walled conference room on the 4th floor, the only thing rising faster than the relative humidity was the audacity of the man sitting across from me. The room was already uncomfortable. I didn't need a digital gauge to tell me that the temperature had drifted 2 degrees above the optimal set point. I could feel it in the friction of my tweed blazer against my skin, a subtle, sticky shift that meant the air handling unit in Zone 4 was struggling to compensate for the body heat of the 4 people sitting opposite me. For a quarter of a century, my body had been calibrated to the pulse of this building, a fortress I had personally designed to protect masterpieces from the unforgiving, blistering heat of the Arizona desert. To me, this building was a living organism, a complex system of lungs and arteries designed to keep history alive. But the man sitting across from me didn't care about thermal bridging or dew points. He cared about optics. He cared about the vibe. Brody, the newly appointed Vice President of Innovation, tapped his stylus against the glass surface of the mahogany table, a rhythmic, impatient clack, clack, clack that grated against the silence I had carefully cultivated in this wing. He wasn't looking at me. He was fixated on a high-definition 3D rendering displayed on the wall monitor. A colorful, open-concept nightmare that involved punching massive, jagged holes into the structural concrete of my secure facility. He cleared his throat, finally meeting my eyes with a look that was equal parts pity and dismissal, the kind of look one gives to a payphone or a fax machine. He adjusted his glasses frames that were trendy, but structurally flimsy, and leaned forward. "Meredith," he began, his voice smooth and practiced, lacking any real weight. "We appreciate the stability you've provided over the decades. Truly. But the firm is pivoting. We're moving toward a consumer-facing transparency model. We need the space to breathe. We need synergy." He used the word like a weapon, and frankly, your operational style constitutes a legacy blocker. We're building a destination, not a bunker. He didn't say the word fired immediately. He wrapped the termination in layers of corporate cotton wool, talking about early retirement packages, strategic realignment, and transition periods. But the message was crystal clear. I was the legacy blocker. I was the fossilized relic that stood between him and his skylights. Beside him sat Sienna, the interior designer he had brought in, a woman who treated architectural physics like a suggestion rather than a law. She nodded enthusiastically at everything Brody said, flipping through color swatches that I knew, instantly, contained pigments that would degrade under UV light. When Brody finally slid the thick separation agreement across the table, I didn't reach for it. I didn't look at the severance figures. I simply looked past him, at the rendering on the screen. It showed the East Wing, the heart of our Class A storage, bathed in sunlight, with floor-to-ceiling windows replacing the sheer walls. "You realize," I said, my voice steady and low, stripping away any emotion that might give him the satisfaction of a reaction, that the East Wing was built with pre-stressed, post-tension concrete to withstand a seismic event. It is a sealed environment. If you cut into those sheer walls to install windows, you don't just let in light. You break the vapor barrier. The humidity will spike to 60% within an hour. The oil paint on the 17th century collection will begin to expand. The canvas will slacken. By the end of the week, the varnish will micro-crack. You are proposing to destroy the assets we are paid to protect. Brody laughed. It was a dry, dismissive sound, devoid of understanding. He exchanged a knowing look with Sienna. Meredith, please, he said, shaking his head as if explaining the concept of color to a blind person. This is 2024. We have smart glass. We have active climate mitigation systems. You're thinking in terms of mausoleums. We're building a gallery. We want the clients to see their investments. The board agrees with me. The bunker aesthetic is over. We need you to hand over your credentials and your keys by the end of the day. Security will escort you out. I stood up slowly. My knees popped, a sound that seemed loud in the sudden silence. I didn't argue. There is no point in arguing with a man who believes he can negotiate with the laws of thermodynamics. I smoothed the front of my skirt. I walked over to the window, the only window in this administrative block, and looked down at the employee parking lot. The asphalt was shimmering in the heat. Understood, I said. Brody looked disappointed. He wanted a fight. He wanted the weeping older woman pleading for her health insurance. He wanted to feel powerful by denying mercy. My calm was robbing him of his climax. Great, he said, checking his watch. Sienna will handle the transition. I walked back to my office, the space I had occupied since the foundation was poured. It was a functional room, devoid of the trendy beanbag chairs Brody favored. It was dominated by monitors displaying real-time feeds of the pressure sensors, temperature gradients, and particulate counters. I sat down in my chair, a heavy, ergonomic antique, and began to pack. I didn't take much. I took the framed photo of my late husband, who had been the structural engineer for this very building. I took my jade plant, a resilient thing that thrived on neglect, and I took a specific external hard drive from my safe, labeled simply, As Built, 1999. It contained the original schematics, the locations of the hidden conduit lines, and the backup codes for the building management system. The staff watched me from their cubicles as I packed. I could feel their eyes on my back. I saw the relief in their faces. They knew a purge was coming, a restructuring, and they were just glad the axe had fallen on the old woman in operations and not on them. Did you hear? Meredith is out. Finally. Maybe we can get a coffee bar now. I let them stare. They saw a defeated executive carrying a cardboard box. They didn't see the landlord. As I walked through the lobby for the last time, the cool, recycled air brushed against my face. I paused by the main security console. The guard, a young man named Kevin, whom I had hired and trained to spot a water leak from 50 yards away, looked down at his shoes, unable to meet my gaze. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he mumbled, his face flushing red. Brody sent the order down. "Full lockout on your badge, effective at 5 p.m. He said to make sure you didn't take any proprietary data." I nodded gently, feeling a strange pang of sympathy for him. He was just a cog in the machine that was about to break. "It's all right, Kevin. Just remember to keep the backup generator logs updated. The fuel filters need changing next Tuesday." I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the heat. The air outside was heavy, wet, and oppressive, a stark contrast to the surgically dry atmosphere of the vault. It felt like walking into a sauna. I walked to my car, a sensible sedan parked in the furthest spot to leave room for clients. I placed the box on the passenger seat and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. I looked up at the monolithic gray facade of the building. It wasn't just a warehouse, it was a bank vault for culture. I knew where every rebar rod was buried. I knew the flow rate of the fire suppression pipes. I was the only one who knew the combination to its heart. I didn't go home. I drove 2 blocks away and pulled into the parking lot of a nondescript coffee shop that offered a direct, elevated line of sight to the facility's rear loading dock. I ordered a black tea, no sugar. I sat at a table by the window, opened my laptop, and connected to the secure Wi-Fi I used for remote diagnostics. I didn't try to log into the company's server. Brody would have had IT kill my user account the moment I left the room. Instead, I opened a browser and navigated to a generic IP address that looked like nothing to the untrained eye. It was the login portal for the BMS, the building management system. The company, Brody, Harrington, the board, they rented the building. They were tenants. But the ironclad trust owned the land, the shell, and the mechanical heart of it. And as the sole trustee of the Ironclad Trust, a vehicle I had created 20 years ago to save the original founders from bankruptcy, my credentials weren't on the company payroll server. They were hard-coded into the building's silicon soul. I typed in my username. Admin, root. I typed in the password, a string of characters I had memorized on the day the concrete cured. Access granted. The screen populated with data, a symphony of numbers that sang to me. Air handlers. Normal. Humidity sensors. 45%. Fire suppression zones. Standby. But then, I saw the alerts. They flashed in yellow text at the bottom of the screen. Brody wasn't wasting time. The maintenance mode flag had been activated for Zone 3, the East Wing. I pulled up the external camera feed. The grain was sharp. I saw a white, unmarked van backing up to the service entrance. It wasn't one of our approved vendors. It wasn't the specialized structural firm we used for maintenance. It was a generic rental van. Men in dusty t-shirts and jeans were unloading heavy equipment. Jackhammers, concrete saws, and massive rolls of plastic sheeting. There were no city permit numbers on the side of the truck. No licensed contractor decals. Brody was doing a wildcat renovation. Fast, cheap, and entirely off the books. He wanted to get the skylights cut and the windows framed before the next board meeting to prove his bias for action. He was bypassing the city permitting process because permits took months, and Brody operated on internet time. My phone buzzed on the table. It was Harrington, the CEO. I looked at the caller ID and let it go to voicemail. He was likely calling to offer some patronizing apology, or perhaps to ask where I kept the password for the vendor portal. I ignored it. I watched the screen. I saw Brody and Sienna enter the East Wing on the interior camera feed. They were wearing pristine white hard hats that looked like they had been bought at a costume shop, shiny, unscratched, ridiculous. Brody was gesturing wildly at the north wall, the primary load-bearing shear wall that protected the Class A storage vault. He slapped a piece of blue painter's tape on the concrete in a large square shape. "Cut here," the gesture said. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had saved under emergency, county. It wasn't 911. It was the direct line to the Code Enforcement Division. "This is Meredith," I said when the familiar voice of the clerk answered. I kept my voice flat. Professional. "I need to report an active, unpermitted structural demolition at 400 Innovation Drive. Class 1 commercial facility. Hazardous materials on site." The clerk paused. "Meredith? Is that you? I thought you retired." "I did," I said, my eyes fixed on the screen where a worker was plugging in a heavy-duty concrete saw. "But gravity didn't. They are cutting into a shear wall, and they don't have a structural engineer on site. They are about to compromise the envelope. I'll dispatch an inspector," she said, the clicking of her keyboard audible, "but it's busy today. It might take an hour." "An hour is too long," I whispered to myself as I hung up. On the screen, the saw blade whirred to life. It bit into the concrete. A cloud of gray dust erupted, filling the enclosed space of the hallway instantly. The worker coughed, waving his hand in front of his face. The dust was thick, silica-heavy. It began to drift toward the ceiling, swirling around the sensitive optical smoke detectors I had installed 3 years ago, detectors designed to trigger a halon gas dump if they sensed even a whisper of combustion. Then, I saw it. The moment that would seal Brody's fate. The moment that transitioned this from a civil dispute to a criminal act. The alarm strobes on the wall flashed once, a pre-alarm warning. The system was detecting the particulate matter. Brody looked up, annoyed. He yelled something at the workers. He didn't order them to stop and ventilate the room. He didn't check the panel. He pointed at the smoke detectors. I watched, breathless, as a worker grabbed a roll of duct tape and a plastic trash bag. He climbed a ladder. He wrapped the plastic over the sensor. He taped it shut. I froze. My blood ran cold, then immediately hot with a righteous, icy fury. Tampering with life safety equipment in a commercial occupancy isn't a code violation. It is a felony. It is a criminal act that endangers first responders. It voids the insurance policy instantly. Brody had just crossed the line from incompetent to criminal. I didn't wait for the building inspector. I hit the record button on my laptop screen. I captured the video clip 10 seconds of high-definition evidence showing the Vice President of Innovation ordering the disabling of a fire safety system in a building housing $500 million in flammable canvas. I attached the file to a text message. I sent it to Commander Davis, the fire marshal for the district. Davis was a man who took fire safety so seriously he had once shut down a hospital because their exit signs were dim. He was not a man who believed in disruption. The text was simple. Active tampering with life safety systems. 400 Innovation Drive. East Wing. High-value fuel load inside. Video attached. I set the phone down and took a sip of my tea. It was lukewarm, but I didn't mind. I watched the parking lot. The fire station was only 2 miles down the access road. It wouldn't take long. I heard the sirens before I saw them. A low, growing wail that cut through the humidity, bouncing off the concrete facades of the industrial park. A red battalion chief SUV tore into the parking lot, hopping the curb with aggressive efficiency, followed closely by a massive ladder truck. They didn't park in the designated spots. They parked diagonally across the main entrance, blocking any exit. Commander Davis stepped out of the SUV. He was in full turnout gear, minus the helmet. He didn't look like a bureaucrat, he looked like a battering ram. He marched to the front door. The security guard, poor Kevin, tried to step out, probably to ask for a warrant or an explanation. Davis walked past him like he was a ghost. I switched my attention back to the interior camera feed. The saw was screaming, drowning out everything in the East Wing. Brody was looking at the blueprints on a tablet, smiling, probably imagining the Architectural Digest spread. He didn't hear the doors burst open. He didn't hear the heavy boots on the polished concrete. He only reacted when the power to the saw was abruptly cut. The silence that followed was violent. The worker pulled the trigger on the saw. Click. Click. Nothing. Brody spun around, his face flushed with anger. Hey, who cut the... His voice died in his throat. Standing in the cloud of concrete dust was Commander Davis, flanked by 2 firefighters carrying axes. Davis didn't shout. He pointed a gloved finger at the plastic bag taped over the smoke detector. Then he pointed at Brody. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew the script. Evacuate. Now. Brody tried to argue. I saw him wave his hands, doing his visionary act. He probably said something about a controlled environment or agile prototyping. Davis didn't engage. He reached for his radio. Within seconds, the building's main strobe lights began to flash. The evacuation siren sound I had programmed to be unbearable, a piercing shriek designed to wake the dead tour through the facility. Staff began to pour out of the emergency exits, blinking in the sunlight, confused and frightened. They gathered in the parking lot, looking back at their fortress, wondering why they were being evicted. And then, the final blow. Davis walked out the front door, followed by a sullen, pale Brody. The marshal reached into his vest and pulled out a bright, neon orange sticker. Notice of unsafe structure. Occupancy prohibited. He slapped it onto the glass of the main revolving door. He smoothed it down with a heavy hand, ensuring it would require a razor blade to remove. My phone rang again. It was Harrington. This time, I answered. Meredith, he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. The fire marshal just shut us down. They red-tagged the building. You have to come back. You know these people. You have to fix this. I can't help you, Harrington, I said, my voice calm, watching the chaos from my window seat. I'm just a legacy blocker. Remember? Stop playing games, he shouted. We have clients calling. The insurance on the Rembrandts is void if the building is red-tagged. We need to talk to the landlord immediately. We need to get the owner down here to authorize the repairs. The owner is aware of the situation, I said. How do you know? He demanded. Who is it? Give me the number for the Ironclad Trust right now. You don't need a number, Harrington, I said, standing up and closing my laptop. I'm across the street. I'll be there in 2 minutes. And bring your checkbook. You have a lot of damage to pay for. I hung up. I smoothed my skirt, picked up my bag, and walked out of the coffee shop. The humidity hit me again, but this time, it felt like victory. As I crossed the street toward the crowd of displaced employees, I saw Brody standing by his Tesla, looking small and defeated. He looked up and saw me approaching. The look on his face shifted from confusion to a dawning, terrifying realization. He had drilled a hole in my wall. Now, I was going to bury him in it. The transition from the air-conditioned stillness of the coffee shop to the blistering reality of the parking lot was physical, a wall of heat and noise that hit me the moment I stepped off the curb. The Arizona sun was unforgiving, baking the asphalt until it shimmered, turning the gathered crowd of displaced employees into a sweating, chaotic mosaic of confusion. Behind me, the safety of the perimeter fence stood intact. Ahead of me lay the consequences of arrogance. I moved through the heat with a deliberate, Measured pace, my heels clicking a steady, rhythmic cadence against the pavement that cut through the murmur of the crowd like a metronome. I did not rush. Panic is for those who do not have a plan, and I had planned this moment down to the second. Harrington, the chief executive officer, spotted me before I even reached the police tape. He looked less like a captain of industry and more like a man watching his life insurance policy burn to the ground in slow motion. He broke away from a frantic shouting match with his general counsel and rushed toward me, wiping a sheen of perspiration from his forehead with a silk handkerchief that was already wilted and useless. Brody trailed behind him, looking stripped of his earlier bravado, resembling a child who had broken a priceless vase and was waiting for the adults to fix it. "Meredith!" Harrington shouted, his voice straining against the mechanical roar of the idling fire trucks. "Thank God you're here. Look, this is a disaster, a complete, unmitigated disaster. The fire marshal is talking about a 6-month shutdown. He's citing codes I've never even heard of. We need the owner. We need the Ironclad Trust on the phone now. Do you have the contact? You handled the lease renewals for the last decade. Get them on the line and tell them we will pay whatever they want to lift this red tag." I stopped exactly 3 feet from him. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't offer a platitude or a false promise of assistance. I just stood there, holding my handbag with both hands, watching the way the heat was causing the veins in his temple to throb. The chaotic energy of the scene seemed to break around me like waves against a rock. "I told you on the phone, Harrington," I said, my voice cutting through the humid, dust-filled air with the precision of a surgical scalpel. "The owner is here." Harrington blinked, the sweat dripping into his eyes, stinging them. He looked around me, scanning the parking lot for a limousine, a lawyer in a suit, or anyone who looked like a landlord. "Where? Who?" "I don't have time for riddles, Meredith." "I am the Ironclad Trust," I said. The silence that followed was heavier than the concrete walls of the building behind us. It wasn't a silence of peace, it was the vacuum created when a fundamental truth sucks the oxygen out of a lie. Harrington stared at me. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His brain was visibly struggling to reconcile the two images he held of me. Meredith, the boring operations manager he had ignored for 5 years, the woman he considered a legacy blocker, and the faceless, powerful entity that owned the ground he stood on. That's impossible," Brody stammered from behind him, his voice thin and reedy, lacking all of its previous marketing swagger. "You're an employee. You answer to us. You carried a cardboard box out of here 4 hours ago." I turned my gaze to Brody. I didn't glare. I looked at him with the detached curiosity one might have for a termite that has chewed through a support beam. I answered to the building. "Brody, you were just the tenants who paid for the privilege of occupying it, and as of 45 minutes ago, when you ordered a worker to disable a life safety device to facilitate your renovation, you violated Clause 14, subsection C, of your lease agreement, gross negligence, criminal endangerment of the asset. You didn't just break a rule, you voided your right to exist in this space." I reached into my bag and pulled out a single, folded document. It wasn't the original deed. I wasn't foolish enough to bring that into a construction zone, but a notarized affidavit of ownership listing Meredith Fee Stone as the sole beneficiary and trustee of the Ironclad Trust. I held it out to Harrington. He took it. His hands were shaking, the paper rattling in the hot wind. He read the first paragraph. Then he read the signature line. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint in the heat. He looked up at me, and for the first time in our professional relationship, he saw me. He didn't see a subordinate. He saw the person holding the guillotine blade. "Meredith," Harrington whispered, the fight draining out of him as the reality set in. "We can fix this. I'll fire Brody, right now." "He's gone. Look at him. He's fired," Brody gasped, stepping back. But Harrington ignored him, desperate to salvage the unsalvageable. "We'll pay for the restoration. We'll pay a penalty, double rent for the next year. Just, please, call off the marshal. Lift the eviction. If the clients find out we were locked out, if the art collectors know their assets are in a red-tagged building, the reputation of the firm is destroyed. The reputation of the firm was destroyed the moment you decided that physics was a negotiation," I said, my tone devoid of sympathy. "You want to pay for the restoration? You will. That is stipulated in the indemnity clause. But you won't be doing it as tenants. You'll be doing it as a liability payment. You can't do this." Harrington pleaded, stepping closer, invading my personal space with the smell of expensive cologne and fear. We have rights. We have a contract. You had a contract, I corrected him. You breached it. And frankly, Harrington, I don't want your money. I have plenty of money. The Ironclad Trust has been collecting your rent checks for 15 years and investing them in municipal bonds and infrastructure. What I want is to protect the Rembrandts you left sitting in a room filled with silica dust and rising humidity. I checked my watch. Speaking of which, the remote lockdown protocol initiates in 2 minutes. If you have car keys, laptops, or personal medication inside, I suggest you ask the fire marshal for an escort to retrieve them immediately, because once the system cycles, not even your master badge will open those doors. As if on cue, a loud, mechanical clunk echoed from the main entrance behind them. The heavy magnetic locks on the glass doors engaged. The green LEDs on the card readers turned a solid, unforgiving red. It was the sound of a fortress sealing its gates against an invading force. Brody ran to the door, panic finally overriding his shock. He slapped his badge against the reader. BEEP, 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 access denied. He tried again, harder. BEEP, BEEP, BEEP. He looked through the glass, into the lobby where the innovation banner still hung, now looking like a mockery of his ambition. He was locked out of the future he had tried to smash his way into. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in the difference between motion and progress. While Harrington and his legal team ran around filing emergency injunctions that were immediately tossed out by judges who understand property law better than they understood corporate spin, I was coordinating the logistics of a tactical retreat. I didn't go home. I set up a command post in the mobile office trailer of the specialized art handlers I had called in. These weren't movers. These were conservation technicians. They wore white gloves and booties. They didn't carry boxes. They carried climate-controlled crating systems. I had called Lars, my former head of maintenance, who had quit 2 months prior because he refused to work under Brody's chaotic management. Lars came back within an hour, bringing a team of 4 engineers. Their job wasn't to save the company's furniture, it was to stabilize the East Wing. I watched from the trailer as Lars directed the installation of temporary dehumidifiers. They ran ducting through the service vents, bypassing the compromised HVAC units. They worked with the precision of a surgical team. Inside the building, the relative humidity had spiked to 58% dangerous, but not yet catastrophic. Within 4 hours of Lars taking control, it was back down to 48%. The bleed had been stopped. Harrington tried one last Hail Mary. He showed up at the perimeter fence on the second day. He looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours. His tie was gone, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He offered me a structured buyout, millions of dollars to sell the building to the company, a desperate attempt to own the mistake so he could bury it. "It's a generous offer, Meredith," he said, his voice raspy, gripping the chain-link fence. "Take the money. Go to an island. Why do you care about this concrete box so much? It's just a warehouse." "Because it's not just a box, Harrington," I said, standing on the cool side of the fence. "It's a promise. When a collector gives us a Vermeer, they aren't paying for storage, they are paying for time. They are paying us to freeze time, to stop the entropy that wants to turn that canvas into dust. You broke that promise because you wanted a skylight. You can't buy trust back with a check." I turned my back on him and walked toward the loading dock. I heard him kick the fence in frustration. It was a hollow, metallic sound. The sound of a man who had spent his whole life thinking value was a number on a spreadsheet, never realizing that value is actually found in what you protect. By the morning of the 3rd day, the eviction was absolute. The specialized trucks from the art collectors had arrived. I had personally contacted the insurance underwriters for the top 10 clients. I didn't lie to them. I didn't spin it. I told them the absolute truth. There was a structural breach during an unauthorized renovation. The facility is currently under a red tag order. However, the assets are secure, and I am personally overseeing their transfer to safe harbor. Because I had spent 25 years building relationships with these underwriters, they trusted me. They didn't sue the Ironclad Trust, they sued Harrington's company for breach of custodial duty. The final stage was the physical removal of the tenant's property. I hired a third-party liquidation firm to clear out the Creative Hive furniture. It was satisfying, in a grim, necessary way, to watch the bright orange beanbag chairs and the foosball tables being tossed into a dumpster. They were symbols of the arrogance that had almost destroyed the facility. Brody showed up one last time. He wasn't there to fight. He was there to collect a box of personal items that security had cleared. He looked stripped of his veneer. The trendy glasses were gone, replaced by contacts. He wore a t-shirt and jeans. He looked young and foolish, and entirely small against the backdrop of the building he had tried to conquer. He stopped when he saw me standing by the open bay door, holding a clipboard. "You planned this," he said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was a realization. You knew I would try to cut the wall. I knew you were impatient." I corrected him, making a note on my inventory sheet. "And I knew you didn't read. I didn't plan for you to break the law, Brody. You did that all on your own. I just made sure I had the documentation ready when you did. I just wanted to make it better," he whispered, looking at the boarded-up hole in the wall. It was so gloomy in here. "It's a vault, Brody," I said, looking him in the eye. "It's supposed to be gloomy. The sun is a destroyer. If you want light, go work in a greenhouse." He walked away, carrying his box toward his car. He didn't look back. I watched him go, feeling the humidity of the afternoon begin to fade as the desert evening set in. The heat was breaking. The balance was returning. Once the last truck had pulled away and the security gates were locked, I walked back into the building. The silence was profound. The terrible, thumping electronic music was gone. The frantic energy of the disruption was gone. The lobby was empty, save for the faint outline on the wall where the company logo had been peeled away, leaving a ghost of their failed tenure. I walked to the elevator and keyed in my override code. The doors slid open with a smooth, heavy whisper. I rode up to the 4th floor. I walked past the conference room, past the empty cubicles, and down the hall to the east wing. The hole in the wall was still there, covered now by heavy-duty plywood and sealed with industrial vapor barrier tape. It was a scar, but it was a healing one. Lars had already scheduled the structural concrete repair for Monday. It would be expensive, and Harrington's security deposit would barely cover half of it, but the ironclad trust could afford it. I walked into the center of the vault. The art was gone, moved to temporary secure storage, but the soul of the room remained. I stood in the center of the vast, windowless space. I closed my eyes. I listened. I could hear the hum of the air handlers. Thrum, thrum, thrum. Steady. Rhythmic. I could hear the settling of the foundation, the groan of steel and stone contracting as the night cooled the desert. I took a deep breath. The air was crisp. It tasted of filtered dust and stability. I pulled the hygrometer from my pocket. 45%. Perfect. I walked over to the main support column, the one Brody had wanted to demolish to open up the flow. I placed my hand against the cold, rough concrete. It felt solid. It felt permanent. Harrington and Brody had thought they were the masters of this universe because they held the titles. They didn't understand that titles are temporary. Gravity, chemistry, and contracts. Those are the only things that endure. They had tried to fight reality with buzzwords, and reality had won. I wasn't just a disgruntled employee. I wasn't just a landlord. I was the custodian, and I had done my job. I turned off the main lights, leaving only the amber security floods washing over the empty floor. The building seemed to sigh in relief, settling into the darkness, safe and sound. "You're welcome," I whispered to the empty room. I turned and walked toward the exit, my heels clicking on the concrete, the sound echoing not with loneliness, but with the heavy, satisfying weight of absolute victory. The vault was closed, but for the first time in months, it was safe. They mistook my silence for surrender. But in the corporate world, silence is often just the sound of strategy being finalized. True power isn't about making the most noise, it's about owning the foundation everyone else is merely renting. If you've ever been underestimated by a visionary or forced to pack a box while knowing you held the real keys, remember, you aren't obsolete. You're just waiting for the lease to expire. If this spoke to you, hit that like button, comment your own story of corporate justice, and share this with someone who needs to hear it.